IGCSE Economics Past Paper, May June 2020. I'll be focusing on paper number 21, section A, which is the first part of the paper 21. So the source material for section A is about Vietnam's growing population and economy. Read the source material carefully before answering question number 1. And the source material is about the Vietnam's growing population and economy. So check the table, and the table shows about the Vietnam fact file, the information on Vietnam's GDP, the gross domestic product, the population, and its foreign exchange rate. And you need to compare and contrast what happened between 2010 to 2017. There's an increase of GDP from 272.8 billion to 662.4 billion. There's the increase of population from 2010, 88 million and 96 million around 2017. And look at also the foreign exchange rate. $1 equals 19,500 dong on 2010, and then 2017 the exchange rate, the foreign exchange rate is $1 equals 22,780 dong. Vietnam's population and its output are increasing. Consumers, workers, and firms, the businesses are benefiting from the higher output. It's because the higher the population, the higher also of the people who can work, which means labor. Some Vietnamese people are receiving more generous pensions and higher wages, while some firms or businesses are earning higher profits. So it means in this paragraph, it only shows that the population really benefits the other stakeholders. Vietnam's population is aging. Again, aging population. What does it mean? But the country still has a relatively young labor force. Again, even though the population is aging, okay, lots of oldies in short, the labor force is young. Age can affect workers' flexibility, mobility, level of experience, and their knowledge of the latest technology. Again, since Vietnam has a young labor force, young workers do have the ability to use the latest technology on their workplace. Not only that, but of course its flexibility and the level of experience do have effects on the workforce. The Vietnamese government wants to raise the quality of its labor force by spending more on education again. So it means if a country has focus on the education sector, okay, the education, which is this tertiary sector, then of course there will be the increase of the labor force's quality. Vietnamese children have recently performed better in international tests than children in richer countries. Education spending can influence the percentage of the labor force working in the tertiary sector as shown in table 1. So again, if there is quality education, then of course most people would work in the tertiary sector and not the other sectors. And in table number 1, it shows the education spending as the percentage of GDP and the percentage of the labor force on the tertiary sector. So as you can see here, the highest when it comes with education spending percentage of GDP is Norway, which is not in Asia, followed by Vietnam, and then followed by France. So you see Norway and France are from Europe. On the other hand, Vietnam is in Asia, And if you're going to look at the education spending on GDP, it's quite high in Vietnam, and not yeah, when it comes in Asia, Vietnam, okay, has higher spending among highest spending among the Asian countries like Indonesia, Iran, and Bangladesh. On the other hand, if you're going to look at the labor force employed in the tertiary sector, the highest is Norway. So Norway is a country that spends a lot of, expenses in education, okay, focus on education, so that people will use its education to the tertiary sector. On the other hand, when it comes with Vietnam, the government spends a lot of projects and activities on the education, but of course, most of the labor force are not in the labor force is not in the tertiary sector. Vietnam has had a budget deficit since 2008. And when we say budget deficit, it happens when the expenditures, the expenses exceeds the revenue. So it's also different from the fiscal deficit, because the fiscal deficit is a budget, it's a kind of budget deficit that happens when the income for the year is inadequate to make up for the incurred expenses. So Vietnam around 2008 had a budget deficit, meaning to say that the expenditures, the expenses are greater than the revenue. And the higher country's high economic growth rate and change in the government policies will affect its budget balance in the future again. So if the government policies change, then of course there's a change in the budget and it might affect the economic growth. The government is privatizing, or what they call the privatization, a number of public sector firms. So there are some businesses which are owned by the government. Now it's owned by other individuals, privatization. It also plans to spend more on education and defense and is likely to raise some tax rates. The regulation has increased the number of firms, both the foreign and domestically owned, in a number of markets. And when we say deregulation, deregulate, it means the decrease or the reduction or simply elimination of government's power in an industry. So here in this example, Vietnam around 2007, there was only one Vietnamese airline, and it only operates 2 routes, and the fares it charged were not affordable to most Vietnamese. So here around 2017, Vietnam has only one airline, okay? It has only two route operations, and the fares were kind of high, very kind of expensive. That's why Vietnamese could not afford it. But because of the deregulation, because there's the reduction of or elimination of government power in that airline industry, the country has 7 airlines offering domestic and international flights. So it means that because of the deregulation, most of the businesses, locally and international businesses have been increased in the market. Borrowing, and when we say borrowing from the banks by both household and firms, increased in Vietnam between 2010 and 2017. Again, borrowing, because household borrowed mainly to purchase more consumer goods, while firms borrowed mainly to invest. Take note in answering question 1, the section A of paper 21, we have to make sure that you refer to the source material. Okay, the source material is your supporting material to answer the following questions. And there are 8 questions in section A that we're going to answer. So let's start by letter A. Calculate Vietnam's GDP, or the gross domestic product, per head in 2017. So the formula for GDP per head is the real GDP. Okay, the real GDP, which means that the country's total economic output adjusted by inflation divided by the total number of persons in the country, or simply the population. So in 2017, the real GDP of Vietnam was 662.4 billion, and its population is 96 million. So all you need to do is to divide the real GDP and population, and the answer is $6,900. Letter B, identify 2 rewards to factors of production. So in section A, the rewards to factors of production are wages, okay, for the labor, because it includes the labor of Vietnam, and also the profits for the enterprise, the firms or the businesses in Vietnam. To further explain, of course, there are 4 factors of production, or the resources of production: the land, labor, capital, and enterprise. And each factor of production has rewards. For example, land, the reward of land is rent. The labor has the wages or the salaries. The capital, interest is the reward, and enterprise is the profit. Letter C, explain what happened to Vietnam's foreign exchange rate between 2010 and 2017. So you have to take a look at the table and as your evidence. So the foreign exchange rate during 2010 was $1 equals 19,500 dong, and during 2017, $1 equals 22,780 dong. So it means that there's an increase of dong from 2010 to 2017. What does it indicate? Okay, it only means something. It fell. Okay, there's a decrease or depreciated. More dong had to be given to buy $1. So when it comes with the Vietnam's foreign exchange rate, okay, between 2010 and 2017, dong, which is the currency of Vietnam, was not strong, okay, compared with the previous years. Letter D is to explain 2 benefits an economy may gain from having a young labor force. Again, the 2 benefits or the advantages of having a young labor force in an economy. So there are many benefits, okay? So if you're going to summarize it, you have the flexibility, number 2, mobility, and the third is ability. Again, I've been explaining this many times, that having a young labor force in economy has flexibility, mobility, and ability, okay? So one benefit is that there will be more flexibility in switching from doing different tasks. So it means that a young labor force can do different tasks. Second, maybe more mobile, okay, and can able to switch from one job to another, or from one place to another place. So remember that we always use mobility in describing the labor, okay? So if it is a young labor force, then it means that a worker can switch from one type of job to another job, okay? Or a worker can can change, okay, because mobility means like movement. So moving from one place to another place for work. And the third is maybe more up to date with advances in technology, which leads to more production and of course the ability to use the advanced technology. So because of the young labor force, there's the ability to use the advances in technology. And what's the effect if the worker, okay, if a labor sector uses the advances in technology? So of course it will lead into increase of productivity. So in short, there are advantages in having a young labor force in a country. Why? Because number one, there's a flexibility in doing different tasks. Number two, there is more mobility on switching one job to another or one place to another. And the third, of course, more ability to use advanced technology, which leads to higher production. Letter E, analyze why Vietnam's budget deficit may decline in the future. So when we say budget deficit, it means that the expenses is greater than the revenue, which means that in the future, why do you think that Vietnam's budget deficit might less, okay, in the future? So you have the word analysis. Okay, there are many points that you need to give, because number one, there will be high economic growth. Okay, and once there's a high economic growth, it will increase the incomes, it will raise the wages, and of course there will be higher profits in terms of the enterprise. There will be more revenue from direct and indirect taxes, more government revenue, and the higher incomes will likely to result in the increase of the power of purchasing. Another point that you can include is the increase of the tax rates, okay? And if there's the increase of the tax, whether it's a direct or indirect tax, it will reduce the gap between the tax revenue and the government spending. Another point that you need to put is the deregulation, and then I explained it to you, the difference between the regulation and the deregulation earlier. So if there's a deregulation, meaning to say that the government will decrease, okay, or will end some of the policies, or what we can say that removal, okay, the removal of the regulations, restrictions in a particular industry, okay, and the privatization, like the business from the government, owned by the government, turn to the private individuals, it may increase the profits and it will result into the higher revenue from the corporation tax or even from the direct taxes. So in short, if you're going to answer this type of question, why the budget deficit, okay, may, or analyze why the budget deficit of any country may decline in the future, the answer is, of course, the high economic growth will increase the incomes of the labor. There will be higher profits, there will be more revenue from the taxes, and there will be the ability of having a more power of purchase. And because of the tax rates, it will lead into higher revenue than the government spending or the expenses through the use of deregulation and privatization. Next item, analyze the relationship between the government spending on education and the percentage of the labor force employed in the tertiary sector. So again, in this question, you have to analyze the relationship between first the education, okay, the government spending on education, and second is the percentage of the labor force in the tertiary sector. Now, in this kind of question, you need to use the text itself, especially the table. So generally, the countries with the highest percentage spending on education, okay, the countries with the highest increased spending on education do have the highest percentage employed in the tertiary sector, or and vice versa. Meaning to say that if a country invested on education, then it will lead into a higher usage of the tertiary sector and not the other sectors. So you have to include, for example, Norway, because Norway has the highest percentage spending, okay, and the highest percentage employed in the tertiary sector, while Bangladesh has the lowest percentage of spending on education, and it has also the lowest percentage employed in the tertiary sector, okay, except in Vietnam, okay, because Vietnam has the second highest percentage in spending on education. Unfortunately, Vietnam is lowest in the percentage in the tertiary sector. So that would be your first part of your analysis. And then their second part of analysis, it can be like, it is expected relationship as some tertiary jobs require high skills, and countries that can afford to devote a high percentage of resources to education may have achieved a relatively high level of development, and high percent spent will create jobs in education. So meaning to say that in order for a country to reach a high percentage on the tertiary sector, there are requirements, and one of the requirements is to have high skills. And in order for the government to get high skills, the priority must be, using the resources on the education sector, okay, because once they prioritize, okay, or to give high percentage or high budget on the education sector, then eventually in the future there will be a high level of development through their skills, and it will create more jobs, not only jobs in other sectors, but most of all, like on the service sector. Next is discuss whether or not an increase in competition is likely to benefit Vietnamese consumers. So, first of all, like, if you are like, yes, okay, their increase in competition will likely benefit the Vietnamese consumers. Again, if the increase of competition will benefit the consumers, then this will be the answer, okay? And what's the reason behind that? Of course, if there's an increase of competition, then it means that prices may be decreased or may be reduced so that consumers would be attracted by it and making them more affordable to consumers. So one factor would be the reduction of price. The second is, of course, if there's an increase of competition, then Vietnamese consumers will have the variety of choices, okay? The increase of choices in terms of sellers, and there will be the greater range of products because there's a competition. Another factor would be the quality of the products. The quality may rise, so there's a big pressure being put on producers to produce good or better products, okay, to attract the consumers. And of course, producers may respond more fully to changes in consumer demand. So in short, if you would say yes, increase of competition will benefit the consumers, and the reasons are because the reduction of price, the price will go down. There will be variety of products to be produced and to be sold. Another, of course, there is the increase of the quality of the product itself, which would attract the consumers. And of course, the quick response of the producers on the consumer demand. If your answer is no, the increase of the competition will not be benefiting the consumers, okay? Again, if your answer is the increase of competition will not benefit the consumers, what are your explanations, okay, or reasons? Probably the first would be the businesses may be smaller, so there's a less able to take advantage of economies of scale, and the prices are high. The second reason would be firms may have less profit, okay, and so spending less on improving the quality of the product. And third would be the MNCs or the multinational companies, may probably or some firms or businesses may be from the multinational companies, and they are less concerned about the causing of the external cost. But in the end, if this is the question about discussing, okay, whether or not the increase of competition is likely to benefit the Vietnamese consumers, always remember that the increase of competition will always, okay, well, this is my personal, will always benefit the consumers, okay, not only in Vietnam but also like in general. Like, we consumers can benefit on the increase of competition because of the prices, because of the variety of choices, because of the quality of goods and products, and of course the quick response coming from the producers. Discuss whether or not the increase in borrowing is likely to have caused inflation in Vietnam in 2017. So this kind of question is all about inflation and the effect of the increase in borrowing on inflation. So when we say discuss, it's either you agree or disagree. So if your answer is yes, the increase in borrowing is likely to have caused inflation in Vietnam in 2017, it means that you agree with it, and it means that the higher the consumer demand and investment, of course, there will be an increase of the total aggregate demand. And when we say total demand or the total aggregate demand, this is like a term in the macroeconomics describing the total demand for goods produced domestically. And when we say goods produced domestically, we also include consumer goods, the services, the capital goods. So when the aggregate, the total demand in an economy outweighs the aggregate supply, of course, the prices go up, and this is the most common cause of inflation. High total demand may cause demand pull inflation, causes the producers to raise the prices. Government spending may rise, further adding the total demand. The economy has very low unemployment, okay, making it difficult to supply to respond to high demand. So it means that the tax rates may rise, which may increase the cost of production, causing cost push inflation. So in this item, there are two types of demand which have been discussed here that you have to include, which is the demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. When we say cost push inflation, okay, it is where the prices rise because of the result of the rising cost of production and raw materials. So it means that if the fixed cost, what else? The different expenses, especially the raw materials, increase, then of course the prices of the products and services increase, and that is a cost push inflation. On the other hand, when we say demand pull inflation, it's a type of inflation that occurs when the aggregate demand, the total demand, grows rapidly, increasingly quickly, outpacing the aggregate supply. So it overpowers demand, is greater than the supply, and when the demand there's a scarcity of the demand, then of course it will lead to the rise of the prices. The question is why there is the increase of borrowing. The increase of borrowing because of the spending. So if you increase the borrowing, it means that you increase the consumers increase the spending. If there's an increase of borrowing over from the firms or the businesses, it's because there's the increase of the investment. If there's the increase in borrowing, when it comes with the macroeconomic perception, of course, it's because the government spending increase. So it only means one thing. So if you're in favor, like yes, the increase of borrowing is likely to have caused the inflation in Vietnam in 2017, it's because of the higher consumer demand. There's the higher demand on when it comes with the government spending, and of course it will affect the other items, especially the prices. If your answer is no, so if your answer is like the increase of borrowing is not the cause of inflation in Vietnam, what would be the reasons? First is because the higher investment. The higher investment may reduce the cost of production, and of course its effect is lowering the cost push inflation. Remember the cost push inflation idea. Or second, it can be like the higher consumer spending may enable the businesses or the firms to grow and take greater advantage of economies of scale. Another is, remember that Vietnam increased the budget when it comes to the education. So if there's an increase of education, it may raise or it may increase the labor productivity, and it might reduce the cost of production, so it lowers the cost push inflation. Another reason would be that the privatized firms, remember the privatization earlier, so the firms may be more efficient now, and of course because of the competition, because of the deregulation, so more competition may reduce price rises. So if your answer is the increase in borrowing is not the cause of inflation in Vietnam in 2017, the reason is because there are lots of competitions in the market, which may reduce the price, which may reduce the the price. Another is the privatization. So the privatized firms may be more efficient. And of course, the increase of education, which may increase the labor productivity and it will lower the cost push inflation. To summarize the May-June 2020 Paper 21, Section A of IGCSE Economics, it's all about the Vietnam's growing population and economy, and it covers many macroeconomic concepts and even like microeconomic concepts, such as like the GDP per head. It's a macroeconomic concept. The rewards of the factors of production. We talk about the foreign exchange rate, the advantages of having young labor force. Remember, labor is part of the factors of production, and always think about the mobility of the factor of production, the effects of the budget deficits. Another is the education. Okay, if the government spending on education affects the labor force in tertiary sector, of course there's really the effect of it. The benefits of the increase in business competition on consumers. Of course, most likely there is a huge effect on the consumers when it comes with the competition among the businesses. And of course, the inflation, and under the inflation, the increase in borrowing. So do you think the increase in borrowing can really cause the inflation or not? So I hope that you've learned something, and good luck in your exams.